Shavua Tov. This week we start off with a verse that the rabbis take seemingly completely out of context and teach us an integral and very deep truth about the Shabbat. Now the verse is, Lo tvaru esh b'chol moshevotechem b'yom HaShabbat. Do not burn a fire in all of your dwellings, your residences, your communities, if you will, on the Sabbath day. That verse seems to be unnecessary because we have other verses that tell us simply don't do any labor on the Sabbath. So why do we have a special verse singling out the labor of lighting a fire? Well, there are a number of opinions among the rabbis. One opinion is to teach us that it is not as strict, not as serious a violation as the other 38 prohibited labors. That the other ones, if a person violates them intentionally, they carry with them the potential for a death penalty in the times when there were such penalties meted out. Whereas if a person were to violate the prohibition of lighting a fire, they wouldn't get the death penalty. They would only be disciplined by what we call stripes. What is the reason for that? Perhaps because fire is not a permanent change. The other labors are labors that create a permanent change, whereas fire, you light it and then it will go out. Or that it's not a labor in and of itself, it's usually a preparation to do something else, such as cooking or welding and so forth and so on. And so therefore it's not as severe. There's another opinion from Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, who wrote the Oznaim LaTorah, who says that fire is not even a labor, it's really a wisdom. It's a talent, it's a skill, if you will. And he mentions the Midrash that Adam and Eve were exiled from the Garden of Eden after the first Sabbath. And it was dark, they were scared, and Adam all of a sudden had divine inspiration, God gave him the wisdom to figure out how to make fire, and therefore it's more of a wisdom rather than an actual labor. So it's less severe. It's still prohibited, but it's less severe. Okay, all of this is good. There are other interpretations. But what's fascinating to me is the commandment that the rabbis learn from this verse. They learn a commandment from this verse that seems to have nothing to do with it at all. And what is the commandment? We do not have judgments. No court judgments are to be given, and no court punishments are to be meted out on the Sabbath day. Where do we get that from? It says, you shall not burn a fire in all of your communities on the Sabbath day. It talks about not burning a fire. Where does it say there, don't be sitting in judgment? Well, the one could say the word in all of your communities sort of hints at a court, because communities are defined by some kind of communal institution, that each city and community in Israel is to have its own Beit Din, its own court, its own Torah court. Okay, but the rabbis say it's the fire we're talking about. It's not just any fire, it's the fire of one of the 4 methods of capital punishment that were available to the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, of the Great Court, back in times when it existed. And one of them is Srefa, is burning, death by burning. Therefore, the Torah is saying, don't use, when you burn a fire on Shabbat, why does the Torah specify fire as opposed to all the other labors that are forbidden on Shabbat? To teach you even that a fire that you think is allowed, that you think is constructive, because after all, if you're putting somebody to death, then that is something that the society requires. So it would be constructive in the end. But even so, the Torah is saying, don't burn any fire on Sabbath, even a fire that you think would be constructive, such as the death penalty. And therefore, since you can't mete out the penalty of burning on Shabbat, then the other ones also may not be meted out, and you cannot even have the court give a judgment on Shabbat. So they take a verse that seemingly has nothing to do with the words in it, and all of a sudden show us how it does mean this particular prohibition on holding court cases and deciding and meting out punishments on the Sabbath. But we will see that this mitzvah is actually something which goes to the very heart and soul of the Sabbath day. How so? Well, one could say, first of all, that fire is symbolic of disagreement and discord. One shall not burn a fire of argument and bitterness and recriminations on the Sabbath day. And well, after all, a court case where they are punishing somebody is certainly an instance of disagreement. There are disagreements among the judges, and certainly there's a disagreement among the accused, between the accused and the accusers. So that wouldn't be appropriate on the Sabbath day, but I'd like to strengthen that answer a little more as to why it's not appropriate, and to just quote my teacher, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, who said that the fire, there are two types of fire. There's the heavenly fire and then there's earthly fire. Heavenly fire is the fire that God makes, and that's different than earthly fire that humans. Humans make a fire that can give warmth and light, but also it burns and it can destroy, whereas the fire of heaven does not burn and destroy. It only gives warmth, it only gives light, just like Moses, when he sees the burning bush, the bush is consuming, it's not being consumed, it is burning, it is glowing, there's warmth, there's light, but that bush is not being consumed. It's green and fresh as it was before. That is the fire of God, fire that does not destroy. Therefore, the judgment of a court and the punishment of fire, of death by fire, or anything else is a destructive fire, and that's not appropriate on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, it is God's day, and therefore we have to light the fire of God, meaning we don't literally light a fire, but we have to shed warmth and shed light. And that makes sense also with an interesting question, and that is, Adam and Eve were created on what day of the week? Friday. Where was their week? They came into the Sabbath, they were born basically at the time when they're supposed to put the cholent on the hot plate. How come they didn't have a whole week? Why weren't they created on Sunday? Doesn't the verse in this week's parsha say, Sheshit yamim te'aseh melacha, you shall do labor for 6 days, and then on the seventh you shall rest? They didn't have 6 days, they had half of one. So why not? Well, because that first week was basically God's week. God was the one who was creating the world, and God was the one, therefore, who had the full 6 days. As a matter of fact, we've in our synagogue, we've discussed the question of the 6 days of creation versus the Big Bang and the age of the universe. And we mentioned Dr. Schroeder's famous concept in Genesis and the Big Bang, that we measure the passage of time not on 24-hour days here on Earth during that first week, but rather at the point of origin, at the location of the Big Bang, as it relates to us here. And I won't go into all of the physics, but basically it calculates pretty neatly, precisely the age of the universe as estimated from the Big Bang. So we're basically focused on God. That is God's week, and therefore on the Sabbath, it's God's Sabbath. Shabbat is God's day. God is the one who determines when the Sabbath is. Last week in our synagogue, we talked about how the Bnei Israel, and we read it this morning as well, we are responsible for the new months and for the holidays, but God chooses when the Sabbath is. The Sabbath therefore belongs to God, and we cannot make our fire on Sabbath. Rather, it has to be God's fire, which sheds warmth and light and does not destroy, therefore no judgments. My son, Joshua, 7 years old, gave another answer as to why Adam and Eve were created on Friday and not on Sunday. And he said because if they were created on Sunday, they would have sinned and they would have been kicked out of the Garden of Eden without having spent a Shabbos in it. But now that they were created on Friday, there was not time to kick them out. God let them stay in the Garden of Eden on Shabbat. There is a midrash that says that. And therefore they were able to have a Shabbos in the Garden of Eden, which they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's why they were created on Friday. I think that's a very beautiful explanation. And we can take that and build on it, because the talents and the skills of the people who made the Mishkan, B'Tzalel and Aholiav, they are great skills and great talents. And on the Sabbath, what's to be with those talents? They're not supposed to use them? A person shouldn't be utilizing their divine gifts? The answer is that on the Sabbath, we are not, the Hebrew word would be batel. We are not idle. It's not that we're supposed to just stop what we were doing before, but rather we are to complete what we were doing. And how do we complete it? Not physically, but spiritually, by putting its spiritual content in context, by contemplating the meaning of what we have created. That is what it means to rest. The Torah says lishbot, to rest. It doesn't say lihibatel, to be idle. And the Torah says on Yom Shishi, it says on the 6th day, we say it in Kiddush, Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzva'am, that the heavens and the earth were completed. Vayechalu ki b'yom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. God created his labor on the 7th day, all of the work that he had done. Why does it say he finished? He ceased creating on the 7th day. He ceased on the 6th day. It was finished on the 6th day, not on the 7th day. The answer is on the 7th day it was created. The 6th day it was physically created. But it still didn't have meaning. It didn't have spiritual content. And for that we needed the Sabbath to contemplate what the meaning is and the significance of it is. we have a very nice custom in our family that every Friday night we go around the table and everybody shares what they accomplished during the previous week. That's the idea of resting, of Shabbat, of putting context to it. We also have another custom as well, where we appreciate what other people in the family have done for each other. These are very nice customs, highly recommended. This is the concept of the Sabbath. It's not to sit around doing nothing and be bored, but rather it's a day to contemplate the meaning, the spiritual significance of the things that we labored for during the week. And God, therefore, did create a wonderful, wonderful universe, and on the Sabbath it's our chance to contemplate the meaning of it. And we create wonderful things during the week. We create a mishkan, a tabernacle, and on the Sabbath it is our time to contemplate the spiritual significance of it. And therefore, that is why the Sabbath is very special, because this lifts us up one more level. That when we observe the Sabbath, we're doing exactly the same thing that God did. And as we have discussed many times, the truest path to true love is identification. When the lover sees some of themselves in the beloved. Just like Adam and Eve, before they sinned, they considered themselves one flesh. Etzem me'atzamai, a bone of my bones, basar me'bsari, flesh of my flesh. They were like one human being, like one entity. They saw each other in each other. And we are commanded to love God. And how do we love God? The Torah tells us, v'halachta bidrachav, to walk in his ways, to emulate, to imitate God. Imitatio Dei. I'll say it in Latin so you think I'm smart. And therefore, by imitating God, by acting like God, we then become in love deeper and deeper with God. God, what did he do? He created the most fantastic, beautiful, artistic creation in 6 days. We create the most beautiful, fantastic, artistic creation, the tabernacle, the temple, the sanctuary, in 6 days. God then rested on the seventh day. We also then rest on the seventh day. We put the spiritual meaning into it, just as God did. And this is our way of imitating God. And that we talked about the fire of God, which is the one we're supposed to use on Shabbat, something that gives light and warmth but does not destroy. So therefore we don't physically light a fire. It's a spiritual fire, if you will. But not only that, God kept Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, even though they had already sinned and they had already deserved punishment. They were not judged and were not punished on the Sabbath. And therefore we do not judge and do not punish on the Sabbath, just to imitate God. So the rabbis put their finger on the essence of the Sabbath. It is a chance to be like Hashem, to put spiritual significance and meaning into everything that we have created in the course of the week, to fill the world with light and warmth and inspiration. Shavua Tov and a happy Chodesh Nisan.